Live and televiewers of your Pan-African channel, thank you for joining us on the first dose of Talking Point over your Pan-African television, where we kickstart today's edition. Of course, we're talking about the economic situation on the African continent, where African leaders have long been advocating for amendments to the global financial architecture. The global financial architecture comprises international financial institutions, development banks, global economic governance structures, and financial regulatory mechanisms, all of which contribute to shaping Africa's economic future. But over the years, African leaders have deployed equality in terms of transactions with these institutions, calling for reforms. The African Union says the continent is committed to remaining active in the global effort towards the international financial reform agenda, and President William Samoei Ruto of the East African nation of Kenya stated that institutions like Afrexim Bank, Trade and Development Bank, the African Financial Corporation, Africa Insurance Corporation, and many more need to get the approval from the African Union for them to be able to support the growth on the continent. Similarly, the African Development Bank President Dr. Akinwumi Adesina has said that the global financial architecture constrains Africa's development. Well, how feasible is it for the African continent to have an inclusive financial architecture? Join us as we unpack this and more in the course of today's edition of Talking Point with our panel of guests. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for honoring the invitation once again on For You Media Africa. And today we're discussing an inclusive financial architecture on the African continent and seeing the feasibility how the African continent can make this a reality. Of course, it's worth noting that several leaders on the African continent, including the Kenyan President William Samoei Ruto, as well as South African President, have on several occasions championed for a global or inclusive architecture, financial architecture on the African continent, and that is what we shall be capitalizing on in the course of today's edition. First, to kickstart with today's topic of discussion, I'm being joined by Dr. Elijah ENOAKU, who is the Director of the Center for Africa Development. Greetings to you, sir. You're welcome on board.
Thanks, Sharon. Thanks for having me one more time. Hopefully we'll have a fruitful discussion today. Thanks for having me.
We look forward to fruitful discussions. Of course, it's all about shaping the narrative of the African continent. We're actually been joined by HILARY TEBIT, who is a political analyst. Greetings to you, sir. You're welcome on board.
Thank you so much, Sharon. It's an honor for me to answer to your invite once again, and I hope to have a productive share in this session of the program. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being on today's edition of the program. Meanwhile, ladies and gentlemen, just to reiterate that you're watching us on 4U television and listening to us on 4U Radio FM 96.3. Of course, we're streaming live on YouTube. But before we kickstart, over the past decades, Dr. Elijah, Africa has suffered a debt crisis that seems to be aggravating over time. Of course, African leaders are of the opinion that they can be able to overturn this situation that is plaguing the African continent, though it has been likened to multiple reasons. Now, in your opinion, as an expert, what accounts for this current economic impasse plaguing the continent?
Sharon, thanks one more time. I think to begin this discussion...
Please, can you unmute your mic, please?
My mic is not muted.
Okay, I can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay, I was saying that to begin this discussion, we have to first of all look at what is the African Union and the African continent complaining about when it comes to the Bretton Woods institutions, and the whole global frameworks, financial framework, that is affecting the continent of Africa. So that's where I want to begin so that we understand where the problem lies. The Bretton Woods institutions, first and foremost, every country in the world borrows money. There's no country that has a stack of money somewhere that they just use every time they need, or taxes are coming, they use. No.
That is true.
Every country in the world borrows money. That's the way countries run. When they borrow money, then they sell bonds, they sell, to get money from taxes and all whatnot. Countries have different ways of raising money. But number one method is they borrow money. So which are the institutions that borrow the money? We have the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, different countries like China, India, Saudi Arabia, many channels where to get money from. Now, before they get this money, these countries are ranked by what we call the Moody ranking system. That's to say, every country in the world, including Canada, United States, are ranked based on particular metrics. That's to say that if a country is performing well in terms of their economic performance, they'll rank them on their security performance, they'll rank them on their developmental index, they'll rank them on so many metrics. And when they rank them, they'll give them a grade. It's like you're being graded in school. So when they rank them, you either have A plus, B, C, D, and all whatnot. And the loan that you're going to get a loan based on your ranking. That's the interest rate on that loan. You get a loan based on your ranking. So countries that are ranked like A plus, or B plus, or C, and so on, they'll get a better interest rate. Let's say the World Bank or the IMF might give them that loan, and sometimes they get the loan about 0.5% interest rate. African countries are ranked very, very poorly. They're ranked very, very poorly. So some of them are ranked like B minus, some C, some even D. So when they go to the same institution to borrow money, what happens is they'll give them the same amount of money at about 10 to 15% interest rate. So in the final analysis, these African countries will spend a lot of their money servicing that debt, not actually paying that debt, because they'll give you a loan for, let's say, if you're under the structural adjustment program, like a lot of countries in Africa, like Ghana, I think Cameroon is under a modified one right now, if I remember very well where you are. So if you're under a structural adjustment program, you are going to be monitored for a number of years, and you have to confine, you have to go by certain standards and regulations that you have put under, strictly being monitored. And your economic agenda has to follow those strict rules that you're given. And not only that, like I said before, you spend a lot of resources servicing that debt. When we talk about debt servicing, what we mean is you are paying interest. You're going to make sure that a certain interest is paid. And it's huge. Imagine that you're paying a 20 or 15 to 20% interest on a loan of 10 billion, for example. That's a colossal amount of money. So African countries spend a lot of their resources servicing that debt. So what are they asking for? African countries are asking for a special situation to address, number one, the debt crisis in Africa. It's astronomical. It's not manageable. Number two, they are asking for an increase in grant. A grant is something that you give a country and you do not expect an interest on it. It's like, everybody knows what a grant is. Like a scholarship. You get a scholarship, you are given a grant. Yeah. African countries are asking for that on special conditions. African countries are asking for rights to be on the table when these decisions are made. Because when these decisions are made, African countries are not there. Absolutely. They do not have the power. So they're asking for the power of representation in decision making. Number four, they're asking for concession loans. So concession loan, time of failure may be going to detail, but concession is simply a loan that takes into the peculiarity of that particular country. You're not just using a blank metric and say everybody has to be ranked the same. This one is A, this one is B, this one is C. Therefore, you get that money based on that. No. Concession loans have specific requirements. You look at the dynamics of the country, you look at the economics of the country, you look at the crisis in the country, you look at many things, and you give a loan based on their situation. All these things and others, that's what Africans are looking and asking for. So I just wanted to give the background of what they are complaining about, what they want. So in that nutshell, the question is, how are African countries coming together to make sure that they pressure the international organizations to see that some of these reforms that they're asking within the Bretton Woods institutions and African Development Bank? You hear the president, Dr. Adesina was talking about it a couple of days ago. He was asking that Africa should be considered on different metrics. You can't use one brush to paint everybody the same. So those are some of the things that the African Union and African countries are asking this Bretton Woods institutions to look into, because again, we have to use one metric. If I give you the microphone that, if you look on African countries, close to the last time I checked, close to about 30 countries in Africa are currently involved in conflict. And number one metric that has been used in ranking countries in the world is peace and security, because nobody wants to invest in a very risky environment. So when you already use peace and security as a metric, they're very low. So just based on that, you are already working on a disadvantage, because your country has been classified as high risk in terms of capital flight, in terms of default, in terms of inability to pay back, and so on and so forth. So African countries are not being judged on the level ground, and that is the basis of what they're asking for.
Thank you so much, Dr. Elijah. I'll be coming back to your contribution later on, but let's get the opinion of Hilary TITA. Now, you listen to co-panelists. In your opinion, what do you think? Because we've seen the African Development Bank over the years striving to create impact on the African continent. And of course, with the existence of banking institutions or development banks on the continent of Africa, do you think it's possible for the African continent to have an inclusive or reinforce an independent financial institution?
Thank you so much once again, Sharon. I think it's
Hilary TITA, are you with us? Feels like we're losing you due to connection disturbances. I'll chime in a question to you, Dr. Elijah, while we await Hilary TITA. Now, I was asking your co-panelists on, given that we have a banking institution, development banks on the African continent that have been striving to cover these loopholes, which of course it seemed to have with the global financial architecture, in your opinion, do you think it's evidence for Africa to either reinforce or have an independent financial architecture?
It is very, very possible, very possible for Africa to have an independent development bank. But let me just clarify something, because a lot of people, when they hear African Development Bank, the one we have right now, they're thinking about it like it's a bank that these other banks that are like national or international banks. No. African Development Bank that we have right now, it's a private banking institution. It is not an architecture for an African, designed by the African Union. Let me put it that way. No. This is a private institution, and it will be surprised for people to know that. If I don't want to misquote here, I don't remember if the majority or a good chunk of the whole shareholders are not Africans, the Europeans. So the African Development Bank that we have right now is a private institution. So that doesn't cater for the need of the states. They go in, they do a lot of agricultural funding, they're trying to do a lot of funding technology, they go into a lot of areas, but they're helping. Don't get me wrong, but that is not a representation of what we call an African central bank. We don't have one. It is possible. One of the preamble of the 5 pillars, 7 pillars, if I remember very well, of the Agenda 2063 of the African Union, is to come out with a monetary framework which will guarantee that Africans are not tied. A lot of monetary policy in Africa, whether you talk about CFA where you are, Naira where you are, shilling, Naira in Nigeria, shillings, whatever, call any currency in Africa, is so much tapped to either the dollar or the euro and so on. So there's no financial independence in Africa. So when you have a financial architecture that is backed by the gold that comes out from the soil of Africa, it's going to be very powerful. But yet, we do not have an infrastructure, a development bank, an African central bank that will make monetary policy for Africa. We don't have that. So to answer your question, it is very, very feasible. Why? Number one, we have the gold to back it up, because what backs a currency is the foreign currency reserve. The currency reserve. And what is it that backs the currency? What is being used as a currency reserve? It's gold. And if you see countries in the world that have very high currency in terms of value, they don't produce gold. So where is the gold coming from? It's coming from Africa. So therefore, if Africa has some monetary policy, monetary framework, financial framework, and with the monetary policy, that currency is going to be very, very powerful, because we have the gold reserve to back it up. So to answer your question, yes, it is very feasible. It can be done. We just lack the political will from African leaders to get this done. So it's not impossible. It's very, very feasible.
Thank you so much, Dr. Elijah. I remember the Kenyan president who highlighted that African countries are being disadvantaged at the international scene, especially when it comes to these economic financial transactions. You earlier on mentioned that African countries, while they're asking debt, or while they're asking loans rather, they are being judged on criteria like peace and security. Now, given that, do you agree with the Kenyan president that there is this sort of inequality when it comes to Africa and the rest of the world when it comes to judging on these economic transactions, that it's looping and, of course, impending and adding the debt crisis on the African continent?
Absolutely. Absolutely. 100% I agree with William Ruto. What he's saying is something that everybody knows. Everybody knows the African country is being disadvantaged. I'll tell you some of the research that we carry out at our center. We have international organizations that come to Africa and they're looking for feasibility studies. That's what our center is really, really good at. We do a lot of feasibility studies in terms of business environment, infrastructure environment, logistic network, what it takes to actually invest in Africa. So, as I was telling somebody a couple of days ago that I had opportunity to tell, when I look at the data that they use, these international organizations, what they use in order to make decisions as to whether they want to invest in Africa or they want to go into Africa and do business, they rely on very flimsy data. They rely on data either from CNN or Africa 24 or some Western organizations, media organization that says, so there's war in this country, 3 people are killed, and so on and so forth. They do not rely on concrete data that comes out from Africa in order to make those decisions. So one of the things that we do at our center is that we come up with feasibility studies with concrete, reliable data that we can present to them that, yes, there might be issues here and there, but this is not as risky as is presented in the media. If you do this, this is a business plan, this is feasibility studies, this is a technical infrastructure studies, this is a development infrastructure studies, this is this. We present all that, and a lot of them have a different opinion when we do that. That is what Ruto is talking about. Africa is being disadvantaged because we are not at the table when those decisions are made. Those decisions are made for us, and somebody is speaking for Africa. Somebody is speaking for us with data that is biased, that is not correct, and therefore we are getting killed. Not only that, if you look at other things, you're going to understand that most of these people that are doing this do not understand the infrastructure network in Africa. They don't understand that. So on different fronts, we are being disadvantaged.
Thank you so much. Now to proceed, how feasible, in your opinion, would will it be for the African continent, given that we see the current debt situation of several African countries, though we have countries on the continent like Botswana, maybe South Africa, and a host of others that seem to be doing well in terms of economics. How feasible will it be if the continent has to, say, focus on getting an independent financial architecture or institution? Do you think it's going to be favorable for some and disadvantageous for others?
No, that's not how it works. This is what happens when you have an African central bank or an architecture that engulfs the whole of Africa. It's been done elsewhere. It's been done with the European Union. It's been done in so many other areas. So it's not just in Africa. When you have that, countries are going to structure their economy to fit into that. Number one, you have a list of characteristics that every country is supposed to meet. It's just like you say, put your house in order. For you to belong to this member organization, you have to put your house in order. We don't have anything like that in Africa. It comes from the economy. You have to make sure that there is no corruption, money laundering. Like we have the commodity structure, where Africans are trying to come up with a commodity strategy plan where we have products that are being produced from Africa, are processed within Africa. Number three, you have a lot of framework that needs to be put in place. And for any country to adhere to the architecture, you must check all the boxes. When that is done, it becomes very easy for everybody to adhere. This fear that, oh, poor countries are going to come in and benefit from rich countries and rich countries, no. If you look at the African economy, we're talking about close to $3.5 trillion economy last time I checked. The whole of Africa is going to benefit. The poor will benefit, the rich will benefit, and across the board, it's going to be an economic juggernaut that no continent in the world will be able to compete with. So it's a win-win for all countries in Africa.
Speaking of the win-win, I think that was going to come equally with the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area on the African continent. Now we just got indications that HILARY TITA is back with us. You're welcome back, sir. Can you proceed? And now, given that over the years, the African continent, like we've mentioned, your co-panelist was saying that debts on the continent could have positive as well as negative impacts on the economy of every nation. Now, given that, what impact do you think this is going to have on the development trajectory of the African continent?
Well, there is no African country or any country in the world that does not
please,
borrow.
can you unmute your mic?
My mic is on, it's not muted.
Okay,
can you hear
we can
me?
hear you now. Please kindly proceed.
All right. I was saying that there is no country in the world that is not indebted. There is no country that does not borrow money. The issue is, what do the countries borrow money for? Is it for developmental purposes? And the interest rate, like my co-panelists already mentioned, what are the interest rate? Of what importance are these loans? Where are they coming from? We can see that most of the institutions that lend out money to countries are the Bretton Woods institutions. And these institutions are not African-based institutions, and I don't think they have that much the interests of Africans at heart. And now, talking about an inclusive financial architecture for Africa, it becomes a little bit difficult because when you look at even the regional integration schemes that were put forward, such that Africans can come together, at least starting from the free trade area, to make sure that the African community now operates together as a single community, with an African being able to live from one country to the other in order to carry out their trade activities. It is from this perspective that we can start talking about controlling our own economy, in as much as we keep borrowing money from the Bretton Woods institutions, which are not based in Africa and which were not created by Africans. We will not be able to have an economy that is our own, because our economy will be controlled by these institutions, we keep borrowing, and in the course, we keep servicing the loans, we keep paying interest, and in the long run, we may not even pay all of the interest. You look at it now with respect to the development index in Africa, you see that it's going to greatly affect the development index in Africa. And I want to tie to the topic of today, that if it is feasible, of which we are going to be discussing all through, that we have an inclusive financial architecture for Africa, then the development in Africa will actually experience growth, because we will have mastery and control over our economy.
Staying with you, Mr. Hillary, you said it's feasible, but to what extent, given, like I was discussing with your co-panelists, of course, as we have several countries on the continent that are still indebted, that are still struggling to be able to get out of the debt stress. Now, how feasible would these inclusive financial architecture be for the continent, especially at these difficult times?
I think the issue is not about paying back the loans. It is not about the indebtedness of the country. It is about what are the economic policies that govern Africa as a whole. When we look at the colonial legacies, which plays a very important role in keeping the African economies abased, where each time there is an integration bloc, countries struggling to trade together, trying to form a common market, we find a situation where security threats start coming in, rebels start coming in, terrorists start coming in to divert the focus. We equally see a situation where, like in the West African bloc, where the Francophone countries turn to create another sub-regional bloc within a regional bloc that is already existing, makes things very difficult. We should look at it first from this very basic level, creating a free trade area, creating a common market. It is from this perspective that we can start talking about a financial architecture for Africa, because even if states pay all of their debt, the franc, the West African franc that is being used by almost 8 West African countries, the Central African franc that is being used by most of the Central African countries, and among others, are still pegged to the euro. We have the dollar that is still controlling the global financial system. We cannot start talking about building our own economy, having a mastery of our own economy, creating a stable economic system, when our currencies, the currencies we are using, are still very much pegged to foreign currencies.
Knock on the door. Yeah.
And so, I think it is feasible, but we must start from a very basic level by following the various stages of regional integration, at least having a free market and a common market, permit Africans to each other, and in turn, sometimes you look forward to the an inclusive financial architecture.
Okay, given Dr. Ladders indisposed before he gets back to us, now you mentioned that we have peace and security, insecurity that is threatening the continent, and this dream of economic independence. Now, how would this, in the long run, affect Africa's dream to actually achieve what we'll call economic independence, given we still have countries, like you mentioned, in the western part of the African continent, up north, which are experiencing threats, say either from rebels or insurgents in their respective countries. How does this go a long way to hinder the dream of having an economic independence?
The whole of this came down and fell on
Dr. Elias' microphone is on and it's kind of interrupting.
Yeah, I'm talking to you, Hillary.
I didn't check if that's where it's coming from. Is there any other place?
Hillary, are you with us? Please, that question is directed to you, please.
All right. Thank you. Please, Dr. Elias' microphone is on and it's interrupting. It's
Don't worry, that is going to be sorted out. But then, like I was asking, how would insecurity on the African continent in most nations
Okay.
hinder the dream of Africa actually achieving economic independence?
At the conception of regional integration in Africa, those are forefathers who conceived Pan-Africanism and later on bringing forth the ideas of sub-regional blocks, starting the integration from the sub-regional levels. They didn't foresee the security threats that Africa faces today. And of course, as global politics would be, the West will always be there to maximize their interests. If Africa becomes a strong economy today, providing a market for itself, providing a manufacturing sector for itself, then the West will become obsolete in the African continent, and that will be a threat for the well-being of the West. And that is why we see them first. They came in the 1990s with the Structural Adjustment Plan, giving African presidents who were very vulnerable by then, who were in need of money, to borrow more money if at all they adhere to the tenets or the principles that came with the Structural Adjustment Plans. These were just strategies that were put forth by the West such that the African countries can continue to become indebted, especially since African countries gained independence. The West were afraid. Now, in the present dispensation, the regional integration policies or process were in due course. People, Africans, accepted it in good faith. They were in the course of implementing it onto the West to see that this is a threat to their exploitation of the African continent. That is why we keep asking the question, who sponsors the rebels? Who sponsors the terrorists? Where do they get weapons? These are questions that are never answered. It is, of course, the strategies that have been put in place to make sure that the attention that is paid on the regional integration, bringing about economic integration of the African continent, is pushed aside and then focus being placed on issues of security. Today, almost every African country is engaged in fighting a rebel group or fighting a terrorist group. I think from my perspective, it is not until we win the war of fighting against this terrorist group, if there is a political will for the African continent to integrate and form a free trade area or a common market, or to move to higher stages on the regional integration scheme, then I think that it will become very much feasible that the African continent can have an inclusive financial architecture.
Thank you so much, Hilary TITA, for your brilliant contribution and insightful one in the course of this program. Now, Dr. Elijah, you listen to your co-panelists. Do you share the same opinion as him? Dr. Elijah, are you with us? Meanwhile, we're waiting on Dr. Elijah to get back to us. I'll proceed back with you, Hilary TITA. Like we mentioned, I recall the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, during an address recently, he said multipolarity is no guarantee for stability without strong multilateral institutions on the continent. He did add that it could go a long way to become a catalyst of chaos. Now, given that African countries have been advocating over time for the African continent of free trade area, which ties to your ended contribution on the program, what role does multipolarity play in harnessing economics or Africa's economic growth?
Well, talking about the idea of Pan-Africanism, the Africa for Africans, talking about an economic system that belongs to the Africans, talking about a political system, talking about any system that is of African origin or that belongs to the African, does not mean that the African continent is breaking away from the global system. The African continent is not breaking away from the global economic system, neither is it breaking away from the global financial system. Multipolarity here simply means it is some sort of a federation that you should be able to manage your system. Of course, if the economic system of Africa is being managed from ideas that comes from the African origin, I think that we would be able to grow. The policies that came along with the structural adjustment plan, let me still go back to it, they were not favorable, they were not crafted by Africans, and so were not in any way going to favor the African continent. Multipolarity, I think in this sense, is simply that let the African continent be managed by the ideas that comes from the African origin. It is not about breaking away from the global economic system.
Speaking of strong multilateral institutions on the African continent, do you think what role can Africans play, especially the various developmental banks, banking or financial institutions that already exist on the continent? How can they amplify this dream of having a strong multilateral institution, one that is in favor of Africa's economic growth?
Well, the issue with Africa today is the lack of political will to foster development, to foster the economy of the African continent. This issue of state sovereignty, which originated from the state sovereignty in Africa, which originated from the very first day that the West sat down in Berlin and started chopping up the African continent into pieces, with each and every person wanting to take its own part of his or her own part of the African continent, wanting to colonize his or her own part of the African continent, and then later on bringing forth presidents. You have almost 53 presidents or prime ministers in the continent of Africa. It makes things very difficult and complicated. Presidents want to be sovereign. They want to be the man at the top. Nobody wants to submit to the other. Now, talking about multilateral cooperation in terms of economics, it is unfortunate that an African continent country will want to sign a liberal trade policy with China rather than doing so with its neighboring African country. The insecure that rebels can leave their neighboring countries to their own country. But then the dominance reason for this is the egocentric and selfish reason, selfishness of the African president or the African head of state. Because if they have the political will, then they will be able to go into multilateral corporations that will be able to benefit the African continent. It is easy for a Cameroonian to move to Nigeria, trade with Nigerians, move to Cotonou, trade with Cotonou, and then come back to Nigeria than for a Cameroonian to leave from Cameroon, go to China and trade in China. I don't know why the African countries or African presidents, head of state, will decide not to foster this cooperation. You look at the sub-region, look at it from the advances that have been made in the course of the regional integration process. In the Central African sub-region, one can generally say it is a mess. They will claim that they are already at the third stage of creating an economic union, or the custom union. Meanwhile, they are not able to even exercise properly the first stage of regional integration, which is the free trade area. So what are even the use of the corporations that are being signed on daily basis? That now the Central African sub-region, you can now move without a visa to Equatorial Guinea, and from Cameroon to Equatorial Guinea, you trade and you come back without facing severe custom embargoes. Why do we sign those papers? Because we've been signing them. It is not the issue of signing, but it is the issue of implementation. When you look at the ECOWAS it is facing the same issue, though they made some advances in terms of their integration. So these multilateral corporations, they are important for the growth of the African economy. But then, are the African head of state ready to relinquish some of their powers in, put in quote, sovereign, what they call sovereignty, and be able to work with their brothers for the good of the African continent? It's a question that one still is unable to understand or people respond to.
Actually, Hilary, of course, thank you so much. Meanwhile, we're discussing the possibility of an inclusive financial architecture on the African continent. Dr. Elijah, your co-panelist, has been briefing us on how important it is for the African continent, like you mentioned earlier, to have an inclusive financial architecture. But then, being the director of the Center for Africa Development, how do you think such an institution is going to affect the development trajectory of the continent?
Sorry for the little interruption there on my part. I had something to do. What I want to start in answering your question is, you're asking about how is it possible, how is it feasible? Where there's a will, there is a way. It's lack of political will from the African leaders to get this done. It's not because it can be done, it's lack of political will. But as we speak, let me divert a little bit so that I put these things in context. As we speak, close to, the last time I checked, close to 19 African countries are at the risk of defaulting on their loans. 19 out of 55 countries, they are at the risk of defaulting on their loan. What that tells you is that these are institutions that do not consider the peculiarity of the African countries. So that's why the calls continue to intensify for these institutions to consider concessional loans for African countries. If you look at what's happening with a lot of countries in the West and organizations, they're coming to Africa and they're doing what we call loans for assets. That's to say that assets are tagged. For example, you have oil and gas, they will give you a loan based on the fact that you're going to produce that oil and gas and pay that loan. And they might actually get mineral rights from your country based on that. That is a complete loss of sovereignty. If you have an African institution, an African financial framework that caters for this, we are going to avoid this huge debt servicing that we find on the continent of Africa. Because let me give you an example. If you have a country that's spending 25% of what comes in as revenue to service debts, that country cannot develop. That country cannot develop. So there are lots of initiatives, and there are a lot of initiatives that have been happening, especially within the African Agenda 2063, but those initiatives are slow. That's what the problem is. They have put it on paper, but they are so slow. So access to the financial market is not there for African countries. They are so limited. Either they go to the World Bank, they go to the IMF, they go to Chinese Exim Bank, they go to those, or they go to the Chinese state and these other countries and go for draconian loans that have draconian terms. Like we heard about the case of Uganda where they signed a loan for 99 years. Who signs a loan for 99 years? Who? That's to tell you how African countries are relinquishing their sovereignty because of this borrowing. But again, I overheard my co-analyst that talked about why countries need to borrow, why African countries need to borrow. He has a point in one aspect, but I disagree in another aspect. Every country in the world borrows. There's no country that runs on some stacked cash that they have kept somewhere. There's no cash flow for countries. Countries don't have those cash flows. They depend on borrowing. But what kind of borrowing? Borrowing at what rate? Borrowing for what purpose? How is it being backed up? So that's what the problem is. So it is feasible. So let me bring the case of the European Union to make it a little bit practical. If you look at the European banks and the European Union, what they do is that they have come up with a list of framework in such a way that every country that adheres, before you adhere to the European Union, I'm not saying that the African Union is going to adopt the framework of the European Union, but if we look elsewhere, we see what's working for some countries and think that it can work for us, why not? If you look at the European Union, they have come out with a list of requirements that if you have to adhere to this bank, you have to follow. I was giving you the list before. Number one, you have to put your financial house in order. Countries that have high rate of corruption cannot adhere to that. Number two, you have to put your debt to service ratio, bring it to a certain point before you enter that membership. Number three, peace and security, because as I said before, African countries are being killed because of being run poorly, because they are being considered high risk, loan defaulters, dangerous business environment and all whatnot. That's why they're being killed. So these countries within the European Union, you have to adhere to those characteristics and those requirements. When you fulfill those conditions, then they'll start looking at the application. It's not like you're automatically admitted. They will start looking at your application. And once you fulfill those requirements, you'll be admitted to be within that financial framework. Now, another thing that you need to look at, Sharon, is this. I mentioned this on your show some time ago. Africa is being killed at the level of exchange rate. If you live where you are in Central Africa, you jump to Nigeria, that's Naira. You leave Nigeria, you jump to Kenya, that's shilling. You leave Kenya, you jump to Ghana, that's Ghanaian shilling, if I remember. You leave from Kenya, you enter Sierra Leone, you have Sierra Leonean dollar. So this mess of a financial system in Africa is killing Africans. To convert, when you're doing business, if you're an international business person and you want to do business going from these countries that I'm talking about, you have to convert from one currency to the other. And the amount of money that you lose when you're doing that currency conversion is huge. African continent alone, I'm not talking about businesses with the rest of the world, just doing businesses among themselves, loses $6.5 billion a year from exchange rates. That's converting currency from one to the other. So if you have a financial framework where all this is eliminated, all the benefit of it accrues to Africa. Number three, you have, as I mentioned before, an Africa that has what it takes to back a financial network, which is gold. Africa has the gold to back any reserve. Because when it comes to banking, for example, I'm not a banker, but I've studied a little bit of this because of what I do. When it comes to banking, banks need a certain risk, a reserve funding to back up in terms of defaultment or whatnot. Africa will have everything it takes to back up that framework, which Europeans are stealing from us, the West is stealing from us in order to back up their own financial network. We have what it takes to back it up. So why are we not engaging in it? So in terms of feasibilities and getting this done, it is very, very possible. It is the lack of political will, I keep saying this, the lack of political wills and egocentric leadership that we have in Africa that is failing us. It's not the inability to get it done.
Absolutely, the lack of political will on the African continent is what it somewhat, to some reason, could be hindering the growth of the African continent. But before we proceed with this conversation, let's welcome this excerpt carefully selected by the news desk of 4U Media Africa, where the Kenyan President William Samoei Ruto was speaking with regard to the achievement of, or the dream or vision of a financial architecture for the African continent. Take a listen.
When the current multilateral development banks came into being in 1945, countries like Kenya did not exist. And yet, Kenya is now the 7th largest, maybe 6th largest economy in Africa. We're a big player. And yet, our status is neither here nor there. It is time that we have a new conversation, because the lenders are important, but the borrowers are important too. Development partnership has two components on both sides. So we must have a candid conversation so that we have an organization that is democratic, that is representative, so that all of us have an equal voice on what happens. And that is why when we had the meeting of IDA, we put our propositions on the table. We believe there should be a fairer, more balanced representation at the multilateral development banks boards, so that our voice, our ideas, our suggestions are on the table. That's number one. Number two, we believe that we must go for a win-win outcome. Why do we put more resources? Do we put more resources in expensive loans, or do we put more resources in concessional loans? Our proposal is that the concessional window of resources has many benefits. Number one, it is concessional. Number two, it is long-term. Number three, it is easy for it to be leveraged, private sector, to enhance those resources. The international community is now awake to the reality that what we are saying is not what everybody thinks. What we are saying makes sense. That we need a fairer system. When Kenya, for example, when we went to the financial markets in January, because I had to, we got resources to move forward at 11%, 10 point something percent. This is exactly what we've been saying. I mean, other countries access the same facilities at 1%. So if we are getting it at 10% and others are getting it at 1%, where is the fairness? How do we develop equally? This is a conversation we must have. When we say Africa is paying 5 times more, it is not just talk. It is a reality we live through every day. And that is why we are pushing every lever to make sure that concessional resources are available so that we can pull countries out of debt distress and we can do more for our citizens and do more for development, so that countries don't spend more in servicing debt than in paying for medicine for their citizens.
You got that right. African countries are paying 5 times more than they should. And His Excellency William Samuel Ruto says that is a reality for the African continent, which aligns with what a panel of experts have been saying on today's edition. Meanwhile, there is a need for a unified currency on the African continent. Now, Hilary, TITA, do you share the same opinion as President William Samuel Ruto of Kenya?
Getting to the point of a unified currency in the continent of Africa is quite difficult. It is a process. Those who envisage the idea of Pan-Africanism and later on the idea of sub-regional integration, they have this idea that someday Africa will have a common currency that you can use and trade all around Africa without having issues. My co-panelists here already mentioned the amount of money that is being lost in the course of this exchange rate. That even within a regional integration bloc itself, let's take, for example, ECOWAS. Ghana has Ghana cedis. Senegal has the West African franc. You go to, there are different other countries. Nigeria has Naira. How many currencies just within the West African bloc itself? These are the issues that affect the economic development of Africa. It is feasible, and that is if the call for African leaders to have the political will to fast-track this regional integration is heard and practiced. If the African leaders remain adamant, wanting to always be that man that controls their territory, not relinquishing some of their powers to keep room for other African countries around them in this era of globalization to step in and invest in their countries, then I think it would be very impossible for us to have that currency. It is only if these African leaders have the political will to fast-track the process of regional integration. I keep going back to regional integration because I look at the inclusive financial architecture for Africa from the very basic level, starting with just a free trade area. Once we have a free trade area, people will be able to create relationships and networks with each other, such that someone in Nigeria even use the currency, so Nigeria may use the West African franc used by Senegal or Cote d'Ivoire there in Nigeria, unknowing, and just the relationship itself starts building that system. There is that communion in terms of the economy of the regional integration bloc. So it is only until African head of state or leaders start seeing that there is a need for the African continent to integrate and form one united state where the African will be able to travel across Africa, do their economic activities without facing restriction. An African will be able to travel across Africa, do their economic activities with a single currency. There is no need for me to go to the embassy and start changing my Cameroon franc into a Kenyan shilling before actually going to Kenya. If the leaders actually take into consideration all of these and they are able to fast-track the process of regional integration, I think it will be feasible, without which we will keep dragging our feet, as it has been the case since 1975, where these regional integration blocks started coming into play.
Thank you, Hilary. TITA. Back to you, Dr. Elijah. We saw recently, before your comments on what the Kenyan president said, we saw the South African president, Cyril Ramaphosa, that highlighted recently that the countries of the global south, including which we have nations like Nigeria, an African country that is a member of that bloc, no longer want to be treated like beggars. That's what the president said by international financial institutions. He cited the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Now, linking up this to the African continent and the stakes involved, would you agree with the Kenyan president?
Oh, definitely. The Kenyan president just echoed what I've been saying, even right from the beginning of the program. He just echoed everything I've been saying, that, you know, the African countries are considered as high risk. Because of that, they are giving loans on excruciating terms, and they spend all their time trying to pay those loans. And in terms of that, how do you develop? How do you develop when you're trying to pay service a debt? You're not actually paying the capital on the debt. You're actually servicing it, just paying the interest on it. So if you spend all your time paying interest, you're just making the IMF and all these other countries richer. And then when you give the money, who borrows the money again? It's the Western world that borrows at 0.5%. So technically speaking, African countries are funding these Bretton Woods institutions. Because if you look at the amount of money that they're spending to service those debts, it goes back to them. And these guys come and borrow at a very low interest rate. So technically, African countries are servicing them. And then they turn around and say, oh, your economy is not good, you are high risk, you can default, you can this. And then they put all those structural adjustment programs in place that are draconian. You can't go out of the framework that has been given to you. So what he's saying is what every African country that is feeling the burden should be saying. It shouldn't just be South Africa and Kenya and one or two other like Kagame. It should be all African countries, all African presidents should be saying the same thing. Why is it only Ruto? Why is it only South Africa? Why is it dotted here and there? They are not speaking as one voice. Because if you look at what he's talking about, it also comes back to the continent of Africa. He also talked about establishing an audit framework for Africa, an institution that will go across Africa and audit. We don't have that on the continent of Africa. these guys, I think my co-panelists asked a question: what did they borrow this money and do? That's some of the problem that we have. When they borrow this money, where does it end? There is no audit mechanism in Africa to audit these things. So if we have a framework and we have an audit mechanism, vigorous audit mechanism put in place to audit the expenditure, audit everything that goes into it, there will be no need for African countries to be considered as a high risk. So all these things, there's so many parts and pieces that need to be put together. So yes, I agree with him. He just echoed the same thing I've been saying from the beginning of the program, which Africa needs to put in place so that we don't continue to be considered as beggars. You're going in there, you're high risk, you're a poor country, highly indebted poor country. When the highly indebted poor country initiative came about, many African countries were clamoring. Can you imagine somebody's clamoring to be considered as a poor country, highly indebted, just because you want to, benefit from a financial structure that is going to be given to the poor people? So we don't need to be in that spot. So again, it comes to the political will of the people that are at the top to put these things in place so that we can come out of the doldrums.
Not just call it political will, but equally collective efforts at various levels from the various stakeholders to ensure that this becomes a reality. Now, in a bit to capitalize on the excerpts from President Ruto, and I'll be channeling this next question to you, Hilary TITA. We have the Kenyan president that has been advocating for a more inclusive approach, while he emphasized the need to democratize the boards of multilateral development banks across the African continent, ensuring that all members have an equal say, not just in Africa, but on the global scene, in terms of the management of these institutions. And now, do you think that this suggestion can actually work given the current situation on ground?
It's very difficult to say that every member should have an equal say. Well, the mechanisms can be put in place to make sure that every member has an equal say, but we should not forget the fact that looking across all the African countries, they don't have the same development index. They don't have the same economic growth rate. They don't have the same resources. And if I am just to analyze it from the political science perspective, I will say that at some point in politics within the economy, there are those countries that will have a greater say, that will make the decisions. When we want to look at a situation where every African country will have an equal say, it makes things a bit difficult, because if a country like Nigeria with a population of 100+ million people gets into a bilateral cooperation with a country like Equatorial Guinea, with just approximately 3 million inhabitants, what do you think will be in terms of decision making between these two countries? It is rather important that we master our demographic structure as African countries. We now create the mechanisms that will permit the voices of every African country to hear, not rather looking at a situation where we create an equal platform, because creating that equal platform has been the reason why most African leaders still do not want to get into cooperating with African countries, because they feel threatened. I will still go back to Nigeria. A president of Nigeria who leads hundreds of millions of people will not want to see his or herself at the same level with a president from Equatorial Guinea who leads just 5 million people. They don't face the same realities. And so talking about an equal level, equal platter, where everyone will function as equal, will be difficult. but creating now mechanisms where the realities of the respective African countries or the global finance, if we want to look at it from a global perspective, where the realities of every single country in the world will be taken into consideration. Yes, I think I will give a thumb up for that. But talking about an equal, democratized platform where every African country will have an equal voice, I think it's going to be difficult. It's going to be difficult because the realities are not the same. Distribution of resources are not the same. The demographic factors are not the same. So I don't think it's that much feasible, but we can create mechanisms for every voice to be heard in terms of economic decision making.
Okay, Hilary Tita, I want to recall some time ago, just ended a Africa CEO forum that took place in Kigali. When asked the question, the Kenyan President William Samoei Ruto on who was the best partner for the African continent, I recall he mentioned that the best partner would not just be China, Russia, or say any other Western power, but would be a nation or say a power that is going to offer a win-win partnership with the African continent. And now, Dr. Akunwame Adesina of the Africa Development Bank says that the global financial architecture on the continent, or the one that already exists, constrains Africa's development. Now, given the current situation of the African continent, as of course the debt stress in which some African countries are actually going through at the moment, Dr. Elijah, do you share the same opinion as Dr. Adesina, and how can the continent overturn this phenomenon?
Let me clarify a few things here, Sharon. I want people to have a better understanding of what this framework is. This framework is not a framework that is going to make countries lose their sovereignty because there is now a framework, the Nigerian president ceases to do this or this one loses power to this one. That's not what it means. If you look at the European Central Bank, for example, that manages and frames and implements the EU economic and monetary policy, their mandate is to maintain stability, price stability, economic growth, job creation, making sure that within the borders there is free trade among African countries. European countries. There is free movement of people and goods and services with those countries. They still maintain their sovereignty. Germany has not given over its sovereignty. France has not given over its sovereignty. Neither, any country within the European Union, they still hold their sovereignty as a country and work as a country. But when it comes to, trade, finance, economy, movement of goods and services, logistics, those things are harmonized. So within Africa, that fear that, maybe Nigeria, which is the juggernaut of Africa, is going to lose its power to a small Equatorial Guinea or this. No, those are misplaced fears. These countries are still going to have everything they have right now. The only thing that's going to harmonize is the custom network is going to harmonize. Goods are going to leave Nigeria easily because there's going to be easy transfer flow of goods from Nigeria to Equatorial Guinea. If you're dealing with what I'm talking about Equatorial Guinea, people are going to move from Nigeria to Equatorial Guinea easily to sell their goods and services across the borders. There's going to be easy transaction because you're not going to have the franc CFA being exchanged into the Naira, for example. You're going to have one common current currency. You're going to buy and exchange goods and services with people easily. The infrastructure network between Equatorial Guinea is going to be harmonized so that if there is train, if there's transportation network, whatever it is they're using is going to be harmonized. Because one thing, if I just have to mention that's killing Africa as well, is the lack of infrastructure. We do not have infrastructure to move our goods and services across the continent. Goods easily go across the sea from one Africa to next continent, Europe, and so on, than moving from one African country to the other. Yet we have one of the biggest markets, when you talk of African free trade zone, if it's actually implemented, we have one of the biggest markets in the world. But we do not have that business transaction between one country and the other. That is what the central bank is going to harmonize. That's what this architecture is going to harmonize. It's not going to take away the sovereignty of any country. And when it comes to decision making, those decision making are transactional. What I mean by transactional means Equatorial Guinea, that's a small country, will still sit on the table, but their voice will be heard. But Nigeria, that has a gigantic portion of the economy, their own voice will be heard based on what they are bringing to the table. That's what happened in the European Union. Every country has veto power, powers to talk and vote and make decisions and so on. But we still find France and Germany and the rest having a big chunk of it because the economy are gigantic, they're bigger. They still have a good chunk of the say. So there's no lose of sovereignty or lose of power or lose of resources or lose of advantage because you're dealing with a smaller power. All those are myths that we need to make sure that people get away from it when we're talking about an African network. Now, coming back to your question, I agree with William Ruto 100%. Because if you look at what Dr. Adesina was talking about, the network within Africa right now, what he was talking about, some of the things that were already talked about. Number one, he was talking about the market in Africa is still like a black box. When we talk about the markets, we're talking about the resources, we're talking about the stock access to financing. If you go to Africa, for example, the economy is in everywhere. Let me say the Western world. If you go to the Western world, the economy is not being run by the government. The economy is run by the private sector. The private sector that makes a strong economy. But the private sector needs access to loans, funding, in order to be better. But when you come to the African economy, the private sector, access to loan is very, very limited. How do you get access to loan? The market needs to be open. The stock exchange market needs to be there. If you go to Cameroon, like I mentioned some time ago, you go to Nigeria and all these other countries, you hardly hear about, let's say with the exception of South Africa, Nigeria, and Kenya, a few other countries where you have a good understanding of what's happening there in terms of capital market and the economy and so on. The rest of the African countries is like a black box. Which country is trading where? Which company is trading where? Which country is doing selling stuff? Which one is buying stuff? Who is doing what? Who is performing what? So the capital market is still very, very poor. So when he talked about architecture in Africa, that's what he was referring to. Not only that, you can't just walk to a bank in Africa and get a loan. There is so much that you need to do for you to qualify for a loan within the private sector. So that's one of the second thing that you meant by the architecture. Number three, the African Development Bank that we have right now, it's not a central bank. I keep telling people, it's a private institution that is doing business like any other institutions. And more than, a good chunk of their shares are owned by Westerners. So that is not the architecture that is going to guarantee development in Africa. You need an African central bank. You need an African Development Bank that has as shareholders every country in Africa. So that's the architecture we're talking about. When these are not in place, Africa will continue to go to the Bretton Woods institution. They will continue to go to China. And China, again, that's a different discussion by itself. If you look at kind of loans the African countries are getting from China, they might be lower interest loans, but they come with the caveats. There's a catch behind it. We call them predatory loans. They're preying on the poverty of African countries. Since they are running away from the Bretton Woods institution, they give them loans with draconian terms. How can you give a loan, as I mentioned before, for 99 years? How can you give a loan with the condition that you don't pay the airport of the country is going to be taken? Like we saw the case of Uganda. How can we give a loan and say, we're going to control the airport? Like we saw the case of Tanzania before Magufuli came to power. They had a loan just for the airport to be constructed, and the condition is that they were going to run the airport for close to 80 years in order to get their money back. That's losing sovereignty. So the architecture in Africa as a whole does not guarantee growth. So Africa needs to look into this. That's what William Ruto was talking about.
Thank you, Dr. Elijah ENOAKU. Ladies and gentlemen, we believe in you learning a lot from today's edition of the program. As we gradually coming to the end of this edition, Hilary, TITA, could the implementation of the African continent of free trade area, given you've listened a lot of insightful contributions from your co-panelists, could the implementation of these African continent of free trade area bring about the growth and development which the continent needs? Could this amplify what Africa stands to gain in the future?
So, it starts from there. Let the African people trade within themselves. Let them build relationships. It is from these relationships that we will start liking that which is produced by Africans. I am in Cameroon today. I have no idea what a common entrepreneur in Nigeria is producing. I have no idea what a common entrepreneur in Algeria, in Egypt, or South Africa is producing, because it is seemingly difficult for me to cross the border of these countries. Creating a free trade area will give the African people the possibility of creating relationships, building networks, and then in due course identifying what is common within them. It is from there that we can start talking about creating a currency that will be of African origin, that will be used all around Africa. It is from that perspective that we can now talk about creating a central bank that will be able to back up that currency. It is from there that we'll be talking about which reserve will we have to back up the currency. So it starts from the free trade area where the African people can trade within themselves, build up this relationship. We still have even homophobia among ourselves. We have racism even within the African people. We saw the situation in South Africa in 2022. Where the South Africans were crying of employment diversion, that the Nigerians are taking away, they're doing away with their employment. It is the same thing that is occurring between Cameroon and Equatorial Guinea. The Equatorial Guineans says the Cameroonians are getting into Equatorial Guinea to get their jobs. So there is this insecurity all around. But if the African continent, the various African countries can create just from the very first beginning an environment that the African people, that when I move to Equatorial Guinea, when I move to Democratic Republic of Congo, when I move to Rwanda or to Ethiopia, I will be considered as an African and I will be able to do my trade activities without any issues. Then from there, we can start talking about building a currency or building a central bank. It is, of course, a very, very important prerequisite for the economic development of the African society, the free trade area.
Thank you so much, Hilary, TITA. Just to reiterate, you are a political analyst. To wrap up with you, Dr. Elijah, you listened to your co-panelists, and of course we have suggested in the course of this program the need for a unified currency on the African continent amidst other suggestions. With all this in mind, in your opinion, what is the way forward?
I think what I'm going to say here is, where there's a will, there's a way. The way forward is that African Union and African head of state should start from the low-hanging fruits. What are the low-hanging fruits? Ratify the African free trade zone. As of August, I think last time I checked, August 2023, only about 47 countries, have already put their signature, and less than that have ratified. So what is the foot dragging all about? Why are they dragging their feet? So take the low-hanging fruits. What are the low-hanging fruits? It doesn't take much to ratify it, to go through the custom harmonization process, make sure that you can harmonize our customs. What does it take to sign like Kenya and say all African countries are visa-free? Even before we harmonize the customs, let people move around Africa freely. Why do I need a visa to go from Ghana to to Kenya? Why do I need a visa from Kenya to Botswana? Why do I need a visa from Botswana to Cameroon and Togo? No, why do we need a visa as Africans? Let people move around freely for businesses. So when the wheel is there and then they start from the low-hanging fruits, a lot of things will boil down. So in a nutshell, start somewhere. Start implementing some of the agreement in the African free trade. And then from there, people will start seeing the benefits. It was on your show, I don't know if your colleague or the other person show, that we had a businessman that came on the show and said that a businessman in Nigeria, he's been looking for a visa to go to Cote d'Ivoire for close to 6 months. But he applied for a visa to go to one of the European countries. I don't remember the country he was going to. It took him 2 weeks. 2 weeks to get the visa. So he was able to fly from Nigeria, the European country, and do his business and come back while still waiting for a visa to go to Ivory Coast. It shouldn't be heard of on the soil of Africa. So when we start from those low-hanging fruits, all the things will boil down. Some of the other projects, they are capital intensive. It's going to need a lot of feasibility studies and hard work, but others don't need much. You just need a signature for things to start moving. So that is my encouragement, and that's my last word for African countries when it comes to this issue.
Thank you so much, Dr. Elijah, for your input on today's edition of the program.
Thanks for having me.
I call to say thank you to you, Hilary TEBIT, for your contribution. Meanwhile, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of today's conversation on the feasibility of having an inclusive financial architecture for the African continent. We believe you learned a lot through today's interaction. I've been NJIX and NABESEH for presentation. Meanwhile, we'll have a great weekend in company of our programs.